I think that by the end of the century, there will be a few people like that living on Mars, probably in a cave or under some dome.
Yeah.
And they may be the ones who are the leaders in transiting their successors into posthumans, because they will have all the kind of knowledge that's been produced on the Earth, but they'll be away from all the regulations, which I think we all want to impose on the use of these techniques for human modification. And so they've got the incentive to modify themselves and no regulations to stop them doing so. And so that's why I think the few crazy people on Mars could be cosmically important as being the progenitors of the posthuman evolution.
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned into The Trajectory. This is our 12th episode of the Worthy Successor series. And our guest is none other than Lord Martin Rees, eminent British cosmologist and previously the president of the Royal Society. Martin has been thinking about existential risks, including artificial general intelligence, for decades. And he gives in this episode what I consider to be the most radical, the most cosmic preference for what a worthy successor's traits would be that has ever been uttered on this show. And that's saying something. Bostrom, Michael Levin. I mean, we've had some pretty big brains here, but Martin's view is one that was pretty shocking and that I actually tend to agree with. I'm going to share my thoughts on that view at the end of this episode in a little brief note. But without further ado, we have to fly in. This is the man himself, Martin Rees, here on The Trajectory. So Martin, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Yes, glad to be able to dive into some cosmic topics. It's been nearly a decade since the last conversation. I've followed a lot of your work. I mentioned I saw one of your recent talks where you kind of spoke about AI that could potentially be conscious and do things in the galaxy beyond people, and maybe that could be, a really positive outcome. Before I even get into the normal worthy successor questions, I wanted to pause on that and just sort of ask you, when or how did it dawn on you that there could be modes of life or types of beings other than people, maybe even higher than people, that could also have some degree of moral weight and could be quote unquote good in sort of a longer term future? Like, when and how did that cross your mind?
Well, I think when I became an astronomer, because I think one thing that astronomers all realize is that we are not likely to be the culmination of evolution, which we know it's taken 4 billion years or so for us to evolve. The sun's 4.5 billion years old, we know that. But we know the sun has 6 billion years to go before it dies. And we know that the universe could go on much longer and maybe forever. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. And so, that being so, we are certainly not the termination, we're a stage in a process. And another point is that we also know that there are other stars, rather like the sun, which are 1 or 2 billion years older. And so, unless life is utterly unique to this planet, it will have started there and had a big head start. So, if there is intelligence elsewhere in the galaxy, it will contain some forms which are so much in advance of us that we can't really conceive what they're like.
Yeah, so you're bringing up 2 points. One is when you are an astronomer, you're clearly thinking about processes at a rather grand scale and time horizons forward and backwards compared to our little lifespans. And so from that standpoint, looking at the grand processes of everything else, what you're saying is it is only honest to observe as what is happening with biology and with our own cultures and species as another one of those processes. Not to say it isn't good, but it's not like, again, in some way, the culmination. Similarly, you're saying as you look out into the cosmos, there's sort of already an imagined idea that it seems likely some of these stars that are a few billion years older than us, or maybe about the same age, could be, maybe even likely in some grand expanse far away, are housing life that could be valuable, in some kind of a moral sense. I think some people look out to aliens, or they think about after people kind of as not being moral patients. Like, well, no. A moral patient is a human. I'm a human. My family is humans. That's what really matters. These foreign aliens that come after us, or these aliens from other planets, that's not things I morally want to care about. There really is a lot of that opinion, Martin. I'm sure you've seen that throughout your career. It's incredibly rare for people to step out of anthropocentrism in any real way. It's incredibly rare.
Yes.
How did you come to believe they'd be morally relevant? Certainly there's a process. They might come from elsewhere, bubble up from us, but the fact that they're morally relevant for you, why?
Yes. Just a backtrack. Let me just say that the scenario I presented is what I think is the way I'd bet. But of course, it's unique. It's possible that life is unique to this planet. It's not logically possible that despite the vastness of the universe, it was just some fuse that was only lighted here on the planet. So it could be that we are unique even in this cosmic perspective. It's logically possible, but I think unlikely. But going back to what you say, perhaps I take a rather broader view about moral value, because I would have thought most people feel that in the non-human part of our biosphere has value in its own right, not simply for its effects on us. And I mean, I should mention that I'm a member of the Papal Academy of Sciences, and the paper encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si, was important because it's the first time a pope expressed the Franciscan view that the rest of creation was not something which was there to serve us, for us to have dominion over, but it was valuable in its own right. And I'm attracted to that view. And so I think it's not just humans that have moral value here on Earth.
Well, look, I completely concur. And we just recently had Peter Singer on for a Worthy Successor episode, which should be live in a handful of weeks here. But and he of course talks about expanding the moral circle, right? And expanding the moral circle normally is associated with expanding downwards. In my opinion, the easiest thing to do philosophically is to expand the moral circle downwards, because when you still run the show, when you're still the most powerful volitional thing, to deign your kindness upon the pigeons and the bunny rabbits is actually, it could be a little bit showy and self-preening, and you're still safely in your habitat at the top of the pinnacle of sort of power. To extend the moral circles upward to entities beyond us, which could be more valuable than ourselves, I consider to be outlandishly rare even today. Now, Singer is more than willing to extend his moral circles upwards without thought. He didn't have to scratch his chin about it. But I found him to be unusual. I found him to be unusual in that regard. It sounds like for you, you just see the expanse of life, things that maybe can suffer or can create or whatever. That stuff, down, up, sideways, when you look out into the cosmos, it just seems as though that whole panoply is valuable to you, as opposed to even maybe just bio-life.
Yes, well, I'm with Singer on this. I mean, the way I put it is that we are not the culmination of evolution, but we are an important transition phase between evolution via Darwinian natural selection and evolution by what I call secular intelligent design, which means intelligent machines. It could be flesh and blood, but maybe electronic, designing still better ones. So that'll be the future evolution. And so if that's the case, we are an important stage of transition. And incidentally, this is relevant to the likelihood of these intelligences, because there's a famous so-called Fermi paradox, which is that if there were too many of these advanced aliens out there, wouldn't they have come and eaten us by now, or something like that? Now, that would be perhaps true, but I don't think there's a strong argument for that, because Darwinian evolution does require aggression. It favors aggression and competition. Whereas what I call secular intelligent design, which is the intelligent entities designing even better ones, that's not involving competition or Darwinian process. And therefore, my line is that if there are these great intelligences, we've no idea what they are, but they may be just thinking deep thoughts out in space, not wanting to expand and maybe not wanting to contact us at all. But there could be huge kinds of intelligence out there which are not conspicuous.
Yeah, and don't share our lineage of bubbling up from guanine or our lineage of fighting tooth and claw, as you are alluding to here, right? So a few things to click into. We're going to get into the worthy successor idea, but you're sort of opening up some of the interesting lines of your thought that I think I'd really love to see more of. I'm sure the audience would. So one of them here is this notion of us being an important sort of transition point. I mean, this show is called The Trajectory, somewhat deliberately, because I'm considering sort of what is the trajectory of sentient intelligence itself, the greater project of which we are part, which is an opinion that you share. Not everyone does. In fact, most don't. But I would consider this to be sort of a part of a project that we share. That's just stuff not being dead. When you bring up this kind of secular intelligent design notion, you're alluding to forces other than kind of bumbling genes, which maybe sometimes are being a little bit deliberate, sometimes are not being deliberate. Bumbling genes, creating variation, seeing what lives or dies. That did something, and now some other process will maybe achieve that. What's the important process that you think this secular intelligent design will have to fulfill? Is it the creation of kind of new variants and testing new hypotheses through physical form and traits and tendencies and whatever? Like, what will this non-biological system ideally do, if it is good, in order to kind of replace and easily surpass the more biological equivalent?
Yes. Well, of course, we've got no idea, really, but just to summarize the two options, it could be that if we understand genetics, it would be possible to completely redesign humans and produce enhanced humans and all that. We hope all that would be regulated here on Earth for ethical reasons. But if there are communities elsewhere or people going to live on Mars, then good luck to them to do this. So it could be that it could be biological, flesh and blood. But on the other hand, it could be that we are somewhere near the limit of what level of intelligence can be achieved by flesh and blood objects, because obviously we know that signals in the brain go very slowly compared to electronic ones, etc. So it could be that the posthuman superintelligences will all be electronic rather than flesh and blood, with a quite different system. We just don't know.
Yeah. Well, I would concur. I think the only honest answer, and you're great about being frank about this. I mean, you've obviously written about the future for a great many decades. The fact, I think there are many people, including extremely intelligent people, who are essentially certain, like, oh, no, well, in terms of consciousness, that's really going to be a human thing, and that's never going to be a machine. Or like, oh, well, in terms of what AI can do, it'll be this, but it won't be that. I think to your point, what menagerie of creation will occur when there are entities vastly beyond ourselves? We cannot know. You know, there could be combinations of Lego pieces we know how to click together. Then there's going to be new Lego pieces we can't even imagine. So just like you and I are speaking on this computer, I mean, the chimpanzee with 2.5% genetic difference couldn't even conceptually understand what this is, never mind how it was built. And so I think your answer is the only honest answer as far as I can tell. But in terms of this, if this, I was just thinking about this the other day, doubtless you've thought more, about what would, right now people think of life and they say, oh, well, life requires, a male and a female, and life requires, gametes, and life requires, a certain like gestation period and a way that cells divide and other things like that. What does that look like in non-biological substrates? I guess my present conception is, if it does well, then it does what I think about. There's a phrase of like autopoiesis, so like the self-creating ability. So life, of course, we go back enough ancestors, you and I were some kind of a snail or something. I don't know exactly, but we were certainly not, we didn't have spines at some point. And so we've wriggled, like life itself has done this self-creating expanding of powers and abilities over time. I would imagine if non-biological does this well, it would not simply fix machines, build machines, mine the asteroids. It would also roll out those new sets of powers, but maybe do it in a more deliberate way, where instead of testing random mutations, it would hyper-calculate mutations and run them as deliberate simulations. Maybe not even in the real world. It would simulate some physical environment and run 700 versions of itself and then see which one is best for that environment and then build off of that. So it would be a much more deliberate version of power expansion than what we see in nature. This was my conception. What do you think it would look like if it went well?
Well, I mean, you've spelled out a scenario, but an important point I'd make is that that could happen if you have sufficiently advanced machines, whether or not they are conscious and self-aware. So I think the self-awareness and consciousness is something separate.
Yes, so I agree with you.
It's certainly possible to conceive that AI will achieve the ability to follow goals, etc., which could be very complicated. But that just means it can interact with the external world in some way. It does not mean that it has conscious planning. And this, I think, makes a difference to the way we perceive the story I've told, because if in fact there was this replacement of humans by these entities, then I think many people think it'd be rather sad if they weren't conscious and if there was no entity that could appreciate the wonder and mystery of the cosmos. On the other hand, if in fact they do have consciousness and self-awareness, then of course we should be glad to give way to them. And of course, let's just think, as you said, the gap between a chimpanzee and us. But the gap between us and any intelligence that could exist by the time the Earth is dying is more like that between a slime mold and a human. So we've got no concept at all of what it could be like.
I think it's, again, I think that's the only honest answer. I've spoken to many a genius on this show who are, you know, I'd say maybe it shocks me that it feels like it's like 20 to 35% who sort of feel like whatever a general intelligence could do, no matter how big it gets. I mean, conceptually, humans would be able to at least conceptually know what it's doing. And for me, like, I just flat out disagree with that idea whatsoever. I think it's to your point, the slime mold difference is like just unbearably far in terms of type of mind space we occupy, etc. So now we're getting into the consciousness question, which is really important. So you've articulated your notion of secular intelligent design, which would be this more deliberate doing of what evolution does, expanding powers, figuring out what solves certain problems, expanding abilities, etc.
Yes.
Let's just say there is a day, and you know, as an astronomer who sees things as a process, this is not like shocking or explicitly tragic to you necessarily, but far enough into the future, whether through attenuation, whether through war, whether through whatever processes, humans are no longer here. So no, you know, opposable thumbs with thumbnails, no more English language, you know, that stuff's gone. However, somehow you're able to peer into the cosmos and look down, and it is still teeming with life, and you say to yourself, wow, this actually still turned out really well. There's not people, but this is always a process. And this process has done, God, what I would really hope it would do. When you look down at that world that actually would make you kind of happy and proud of where things are, what would be going on with life? What would be the qualities of these entities? Consciousness you listed as one. What else comes to mind for you?
Well, again, I think we can't conceive. I mean, it's like asking a fish what it conceives as being the future of life. You know, it wouldn't know.
Well, okay. Go ahead. I'm actually, I'm in total agreement, but lay it on me. What do you got? Or was that was okay. Your point was that, we couldn't possibly know. I guess here's how I would articulate that personally. And I want to see if I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'm just going to articulate it. Mm-hmm. I would be pleased with life if it were consciousness is a value that it seems like if if there is no experiencer, that does feel like a shame, right? And I think, you've articulated this many times.
Yeah.
So certainly I would hope that it be sentient, but I would hope that it would have that autopoiesis power to unravel and unroll. Spinoza has this idea of potentia being the total set of powers that permit a thing to persist, which could be everything from, a hard shell to verbal communication to tool use to you name it, right? And the idea is that only a tiny amount of the total state space of potentia has blossomed. So when you look down and say, well, we couldn't possibly know, the way I would articulate that as a moral good is I would say the magazines of potentia that have gone up from the sea snail to me and you will have unraveled and unraveled and unraveled in all directions. And that this would permit life to stay alive better, because with more power, it's less likely to die by a solar flare, by the death of any one star, maybe even by the death of this universe. Maybe there's multiverses it could expand into, right? If it was powerful enough. And so I would say that unraveling of power, consciousness feels important. That expansion, unraveling of power would also be important. I would hope to look down and have no idea what's going on, but I would hope for it to be rich and complex. Like, I wouldn't want to have no idea what's going on because it's tiling the universe with like some little design, some little goofy pattern. And it's like doing some weird optimization for eternity. That does not feel like the expanding and unraveling of the total set of powers. I would want blooming in all possible directions to be able to keep the flame of life alive. That's how I would say what you were saying. But let me know if you disagree with my articulation.
No, I agree with that. Yes. But the main point is that we can't conceive how this would feel. We can't conceive what consciousness would be. Although I think we can say that self-awareness and is a definite add-on, which need not be obviously implicit in artificial
in some
intelligence.
of the other stuff. Yeah. I think my position is that we simply don't know. Like, there are some folks that say, well, above a certain kind of intelligence, it has to be sentient. I just don't think we know that. We don't understand consciousness well enough. Let me put something else on the table and just see what your response is to this. So, consciousness, as you're talking about your process philosophy here, Martin, consciousness seems to have sort of bubbled its way up from this, somewhere between the sea snail and me and you. Maybe below the sea snail. I don't know. Maybe they can feel things. I'm not sure. But at some point, there was no life had senses. Nothing could see, nothing could smell, nothing could, and then at some point senses emerged, which was monumental. I mean, it's insane. Like something that was alive in some sense could in some way detect what was happening in the outside world. Amazing. After that, at some point, another pop happened, and now things were aware. They could see something swim behind a rock and then know that it's still behind that rock. And like, that was a huge advantage to those living things. And this inner movie that started happening, this inner field of awareness that experience started entering into, became this new and amazing thing, which I think you and I are on the same page is morally valuable, because the least deniably morally valuable thing is pain and pleasure. And so like an actual experiencing entity that's having a good time, it feels like that feels pretty hard to argue that that's some kind of a good. I tend to argue, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, I tend to argue that other pops are likely to happen. In other words, there are things beyond consciousness. You and I are in agreement that, man, this consciousness thing, this is part of the light of life that we hope is valuable and persists into the future. I would argue there are other pops that would happen of entire realms of experience and power that we cannot possibly conceive of, that would even be something other than consciousness, but would be unbearably valuable, but only to minds that are inaccessibly larger than ours. And so I leave open the idea that there are things beyond consciousness that are also valuable. Do you hold the same perspective, or what's your take there?
I'm open-minded about that, but just a footnote to what you said earlier. I mean, I think another value of self-awareness, which is perhaps why it evolved by Darwinian selection, is that it's a good idea if you can think through the consequences of an action before you do it. Before I hit you on the head, I should perhaps think through what might be the reaction if I did that. And then I decide not to do it. But to be able to think through scenarios in one's imagination before actually implementing them. That's a kind of thought which is clearly important for humans, and we don't know to what extent any animals have that. But that's important.
Yeah, well, it is important, and it's also important in your idea of secular intelligent design, right? We'd have to say, well, what would happen if if the AGI says, what would happen to this version of myself that I send off to this part of the cosmos to do such and such? Like, oh, what traits should it have? Whatever, right? That it would have to have a grander extension of the quality that you just mentioned there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So essentially, you'd hope it's conscious, and you'd say otherwise, if it's complex and doing a bunch of stuff you don't understand, that's probably it's a little oversimplification, but it's almost like if you could somehow look down after all the humans are gone, and you can somehow know life is conscious, but also just seeing it swirling and acting and creating it, doing a variety of things that you just can't even ever conceive of, you would say this seems to be in line with what life should be doing. It should be it should be so far beyond me that I'm not really grasping it. This seems to be, what I used to do as Martin Rees was inconceivable to my pet Labrador Retriever or to the slime mold. What it is doing is inconceivable to me. This feels like it's probably the light of life expanding good stuff. Is this a inaccurate or accurate summation of sort of where you were?
No, that's a good summary. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I like it. I like it. You brought up a really interesting point here too, Martin, around Darwinian life and sort of this vying for, this necessity of competition, I think is how you framed it, and how these other life forms may not come up through those same forces. Right. What is your intuition there? I mean, I have a bunch of questions about it, but I'd love to get your intuition. Like, do you think, hey, by consequence, non-biological life at least has a chance of really not being competitive in an overt way? Or would you say, I think by consequence, it would likely be quite friendly and lovely to other life forms? Like, what comes out of the fact that it's not Darwinian? What does that imply for us humans as we interact with it, but also for life itself?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, again, we don't know, but I'm just trying to counter the widespread view that if there's some alien civilizations, they're going to expand. People like Olson have written interesting papers about the rate at which a civilization could expand across the galaxy and things of that kind. That's possible, and it's motivated by feeling that they would be expansionists. They want more territory, etc. But what I'm saying is that need not be the case, and particularly if these entities have evolved by intelligent design and not by Darwinian processes.
Yeah, okay, got it. So what you're just saying is there is no inevitability that an intelligence above size X would be crawling its way through every corner of the cosmos, grabbing materials and taking down enemies or whatever. That's not inevitably where things. And I think that's probably a safe position to hold there.
Just thinking deep thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't sound like that bad of a life. I mean, they could probably have some much deeper thoughts even than you and I, and that could be a good time. So with that said, I think Kurzweil at some point had this. One of the Fermi paradox ideas was that intelligences are sort of expanding. They get to a certain point and they realize like that the inner world is actually vastly more rich and divergent. They sort of like pivot into that. So whether it's physical entities like you and I just going into some virtual space or uploading our brains, or whether it's some grand AI just focusing on the inner experience that it can cultivate, that things actually get to a certain size and then they actually might look inward, and that could be an explanation for the Fermi situation as well, which is somewhat in line with what you're saying there. You're again rightly the only answers here are we don't know, but when you think about general intelligence bubbling its way up here on Earth, who knows how long that'll be. There are many people, as you're well aware, who think that, within 12 months, it's not unreasonable that we could have some kind of general intelligence that could do tremendous, almost godlike things. There's others that say it's a couple decades. Others are still laughing at the idea, although many fewer are laughing than when you and I chatted last. When you think about such an entity emerging in that regard, do you have any intuition whatsoever as to whether in the early stages you feel like it would kind of get along and mostly be in service of what we're doing, or if you suspect maybe that wouldn't be the case? Or is it just, hey, Dan, at that point, it's a pure question mark, and like, we don't have the reins anymore, and there's nothing else I can even say and anybody else can say? Like, what's your perspective there as we enter this dawn of AGI?
Well, again, going back to Kurzweil and the singularity, I mean, I can certainly understand that the machines are going to be able to perform in a superhuman level at more and more things. The HP calculator could do arithmetic at the superhuman level 50 years ago, and they could do more things. But the question is, can they do everything? But the other point in particular is, can they interact with the external world? I mean, I think if you just casually read what people like Kurzweil write, they seem to imply that the machine is going to transform the physical world. Is it going to knock down cities and build new ones, etc.? And that seems to be a very big leap indeed. And the ability to sense the external world in the way that we do, to jump from tree to tree as well as a squirrel can, which no machine yet can, and to do these sorts of things, they are a big challenge, but also the basic laws of physics, which limit the rate at which you could knock down an old building to put up new ones, etc. So there's a limit to exponential acceleration if we think about things in the actual physical world.
The physical world,
not just,
yes.
In the world of a computer's brain.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a chat interface is clearly not the kind of thing that I think big picture Ray is talking about. I think the supposition here is, and clearly this will take much more than 1 year, but at some point AIs will be flying many aircraft. They will be in control of maybe tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands and then millions of biped robots doing everything from cleaning houses to roofing to you name it, probably at some point. And there might even be nanobots controlled by this AGI. And so this AGI will start to touch the world, not just through the 5 senses you and I have, but through myriad bodies and myriad senses beyond those which you and I enjoy. Yes. Being able to learn from one machine doing plumbing over here can transfer those lessons to every other plumbing bot that is controlled by the central intelligence. And so its ability to drink up data from the world, people say, well, it's always limited by human data. As soon as it's embodied, it's very much not limited by human data. I think the idea is that, countless companies now are kind of starting these biped robot things. And I think the idea is that more and more of this stuff in the world will kind of be ambulating and moving because of central AIs that are having these agents do these things. And that maybe after enough of that, there could be some general intelligence that have enough instantiations out in the physical world to be able to all of a sudden now really get stuff done. They're flying the jet planes. They really can build the buildings. They can design the next, pharmaceutical because they're controlling the robots in the pharmaceutical lab that are kind of mixing things and testing things. And they're the ones developing the hypotheses and all this. So it would take some time for us to get embodied, but presumably once we're there, then the consequences get pretty wild. I mean, what are your thoughts there around how all that shakes out? And
yes. Well, I mean, I think the one point is that although I'm rather skeptical about space exploration by humans, if things get to that stage,
famously,
then of course the entities are going to go to other planets, and if they're near immortal, they will not be daunted by the kind of long voyages to take them across the galaxy. So one has to think that if they have a far longer life time horizon, then of course many things that seem impossible for humans ever will no longer seem impossible. So I think we have to think that, and this goes back to what I said at the beginning about whether life is unique to this planet. Even if it is, it's still possible that its remote descendants could spread through the galaxy and beyond.
Yes,
Because
yes.
if what you've just been spelling out happens, then they will go to Mars, and then go much further if they have faster propulsion and longer lives. I think, incidentally, on Mars, they might be better to be quadrupeds, not bipeds. I mean, being a biped is an extra problem, and so my scenario is that the first few entities on Mars will be
quadrupeds,
robots of various kinds, and of course on the Martian surface they'd be better to be quadrupeds.
So, we'll an interesting supposition there. I mean, you have on many occasions talked about sort of the end of the astronaut, not in the sense that humans should give up on being curious about the cosmos, but in the idea that it's just ridiculous to send a human being to do some of these things. We're talking about light years, or even tiny fractions of light years. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so clearly that exploration would be done by entities beyond us. That sort of also, I wonder if that opinion of yours there, which feels very hard to argue with, in my opinion, that this idea that, machines should do the exploring of space primarily. It strikes me that starts to open a gateway to, well, what else are the things where, like, well, clearly something other than people would be best at that job? Because I could start to think here, Martin, that, well, geez, what about, I don't know, human populations are kind of shrinking, but is there something about urban planning where, yeah, maybe we should have some say, but like, why would humans do that? Is there something to be said of, economic policy? But then we can start touching on very sacred things to most humans. We could start saying like, well, we want humans to be around because love is valuable. We want humans to be around because, a diverse life is valuable or something. And then we could scratch our chin and say, well, geez, if these self-designing entities could conjure forth realms of love and connection that are vastly beyond our own, wouldn't that even just be a better use of atoms than like us bungling in this space? So your astronaut example beckons breakthroughs in all the things, including the most sacred things. Are we even the vessel for the job?
Yes.
What's your thought about that?
Well, I think that's true, and I'm not allergic to or opposed to space travel by humans in the long run. What I do feel quite strongly is that if we talk about present day politics and the next 20 years, NASA's planning horizon, etc., then the emphasis should be on robots and not on humans. And the reason for that is that humans are much more expensive to look after and send on a trip and bring back, whereas a robot is much simpler. It hibernates and it can be brought back, and so that's much better. But I do nonetheless hope and rather expect that there will be some individuals who will eventually want to go to Mars as an adventure, and maybe a risk taker, happy to go on a one-way trip and paid for by private sponsorship. I think that's fine. But what I'm against is public funds, whether they're from a European Space Agency or NASA, being spent on human exploration, because I think civilians are going to be sent, and the public's going to feel that they've got to be exposed not to too much risk. And but I always quote the space shuttle, which failed twice in 135 launches. That's a better 98% safety record. But those two failures, each of which killed 7 crew members, including a woman school teacher and all that, they affected the American public psyche, and they wanted to push down the risk. Whereas if it's said that the only humans who are going on these expeditions are really adventurers, the kind of people who would hang glide in Yosemite and things like that.
Yes, whatever.
And
Thrill seeking.
they know they're taking a big risk. Then that's all right, and we should cheer them on. We cheer on these heroic people who do crazy things. And so
Yes.
I think that by the end of the century, there will be a few people like that living on Mars, probably in a cave or under some dome.
Yeah.
And they may be the ones who are the leaders in transiting their successors into posthumans, because they will have all the kind of knowledge that's been produced on the Earth, but they'll be away from all the regulations, which I think we all want to impose on the use of these techniques for human modification. And so they've got the incentive to modify themselves and no regulations to stop them doing so. And so that's why I think the few crazy people on Mars could be cosmically important as being the progenitors of the post-human evolution.
Curious. Well, we're going to end on a little bit of governance and innovation thought and sort of where you want to guide those things. But this is taking us in kind of a fun direction here. I want to, as I get into the last handful of questions, I want to make sure to check the boxes on the worthy successor idea. Thus far, what I've heard from you is if you could look down when humans are all gone, nobody left. Again, whether through war, whether through gradual attenuation, whether through merger with machines, however, we're gone. When you look down, you'd want to see life that's conscious, and you'd want to see life in many, many places doing things you really don't understand, which clearly means that it has kind of gone beyond you as we've gone above the slime mold. Are there any other traits you would hope for in such these machines, or would those kind of be the main two? I've heard some people say, well, I'd really want it to be cooperative. Well, I'd really want it to be able to love. To me, these seem outlandishly trite and anthropocentric, but not everybody feels that way. Are there any other traits you would just kind of hope these systems have for one reason or another to be worthy successors?
Well, I think this may sound naive, but one hopes they would have an aesthetic sense and try and beautify their surroundings, be cosmic gardeners, as it were. So if people are going to terraform Mars, and rather than adapting themselves to the way it is, then one hopes they make a good job of it and make it a beautiful place.
Well, I suspect aesthetic beauty for humans presumably had some survival value, right? When I look out at like a river and, trees and I hear birds, really, what did that signal 200,000 years ago? It was like, there's probably food here. And so like the things that are beautiful to me now, I consider less to be signals from the deity as to what great, beauty in heaven is like, and more of signals from my evolutionary past as to what should soothe me or appeal to me. And these strike me as, this isn't to say I don't appreciate beauty. I have favorite artists in poetry and painting and everything in between. But I'm also not certain if that's a grand value per se, or if it's like, it's one of the sparkly ones that happens with people because like, I don't know, we like certain kinds of order. But I'm not against it being important in a post-human world. What are your thoughts about the more ultimate value of beauty? This beauty as far beyond us as we are beyond the slime mold. What is that to you? What's sacred or important for you about that?
Yes. Well, I mean, of course, if you're religious in an old-fashioned sense, then you will say there's a deity who is above us all.
Yes, of course. No, yes, certainly.
I don't find I can believe that, and indeed, if it were true, I wouldn't expect to be able to understand it. So I think it's very hard to say what the value is, except in the context of the person making the valuation and their senses and limitations.
So maybe in some way, I guess what you're saying is they'd be a good gardener. I'm going to try to nutshell this. We'll get into the next questions, but I'm going to nutshell what you're saying. So it would expand its potential and do these wild divergent things that life does as it grows in its power. It would be conscious, Of course, we would hope for that. But also maybe as it moves, as it expands, as it touches different places in the space of atoms, or maybe even other spaces we can't imagine, maybe hope that those places are kind of tangibly better in some way, like they've been beautified in some way or organized in some way, and that there's sort of almost like a spreading of additional good, so that other observers who would see it would be like, oh, that's also really nice. Yes. It's almost like one more conscious kind of pleasantness sprinkled across what it's. This is my best articulation of what you're saying, but you let me know if I'm on the right page.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Cosmic gardeners. Definitely the first time that's been said on the show, Martin. So I appreciate that. I like it. Next question, and this is a tough one for me in some regards, is I really like, the traits you articulated, more or less, are the traits I would hope for in a worthy successor, more or less. So the expansion of potential and consciousness being very primary. And then everything else, I would imagine, would be basically inconceivable, and rightfully so. As we're moving closer to general intelligence, and to your point, we don't have a million embodied robots of AGI yet. We're clearly not there. But some of these general systems feel like they're getting generally powerful. Lots of robots coming online. Kind of seems like the dawn of AGI may not be an incorrect assessment of our current state of affairs. How do we know if these systems that we're building are inching us closer to conscious autopoiesis things that can keep creating and expanding as life has and as you hope for? How do we know it has that autopoiesis, and how do we know it has that consciousness at all? Like, when we're building these things, do we just ask them and then they tell us? Do we test for them in some way, shape, or form? It feels very consequential. Actually, I'm going to use your quote. We are an important kind of transition period. And for me, for the transition to go well, the trajectory to go well beyond us, that is the big work that we have to do. How do we know if we're getting there? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's hard. As you know, people are thinking more deeply about consciousness and how to detect evidence for it, etc. And one hopes they will come up with a firmer concept of what we mean when we use the word. I'm very muddled myself, but I think we all know what sort of world we would like to exist a few hundred years from now, and what we would not like to exist. And I think that's important. But going further ahead, then perhaps people will think in that way about how would we modify the entire galaxy.
I hope people do consider those kind of questions. And I suspect there will be some disagreements. There are some people, Martin, I'm sure you're well aware, not only old-fashioned religious people, but just even proudly secular people who say, who advocate for what I refer to as the eternal hominid kingdom, where it is somewhat obvious that this shape is the highest pinnacle shape in terms of moral value. And if there are other shapes, they don't deserve to come into being. Not if it threatens us in even the slightest in terms of our relative position of power. This is a huge preponderance of the currently living hominids would have this belief if pinned up against a corner. You are an extreme outlier, even among very smart people, in my experience. So there will be different thoughts here, but I guess as we're building the AI, to be able to, like you said, kind of, you're muddled, I'm muddled about what consciousness even is. As we're building it, to know, okay, is this going to keep the torch of consciousness alive? Assuming we're gone and we're send this thing to Mars and then much farther, is it going to keep that torch alive? Do you advocate we should be studying more deeply the nature of consciousness and getting some kind of scientific proxies for this? Is there a way to do a similar thing for this idea of autopoiesis, this expansion of powers that you're talking about as well? Is there a way do we just ask the AI, are you conscious? Can you keep expanding your powers? Or do we test for it in different ways? Do you suspect these things are untestable and we're just going to have to deal with that? How do you think about it?
Well, I think neurology is the most difficult science, far harder than physics and kind of things I do. And people are learning how the brain works. I think there's progress in understanding the physiology of the brain, and this may lead to a better understanding of what physical processes are linked or correlates with different emotions and different kinds of thinking. And so I would say that the scientific exploration of the brain is a science that's very much beginning and is going to dominate. And that may clarify some of the issues that we are now so confused about.
Given how close some people think we are to AGI, do you think it warrants much more like kind of ferocious work on cracking kind of neuro and consciousness, etc.? Like, do you think, hey, like we got to be doing a lot more here, or do you think, let's just keep science doing what it's doing? It'll hopefully discover the things we want to discover. Because I will admit, in my opinion, I look at the capabilities of machines versus the progress on what is consciousness. Just the last decade, how much farther have we gotten in both? And it's no contest. It's absolutely no contest. And that does worry me, because I would not want an unworthy successor who is not conscious. I mean, do you think we should be doing much more there?
Well, I'm diffident to express a view, but one thing I would say is that if you look at the progress of any technology, it goes in fits and starts. It goes very fast, but then it levels off. Let me give two examples. The Apollo landings were only 12 years after Sputnik 1, and I'm old enough to remember the Apollo landings, and thought probably it'd only be another 10 years before there were footprints on Mars. Whereas we know that 55 years after Apollo, no one's even been back as far as the moon, and we're far away.
Yeah,
and we know the reasons for that. It was an interpower rivalry and all that. And to take another example, civilian flight. There was a big gap between the first transatlantic flight in 1919, Alcock and Brown, and the jumbo jets, which came into operation in about 1969. That 50-year gap. But it's now more than 50 years since the first jumbo jet. And in terms of civilian flight, things haven't changed very much.
Yeah.
Concorde came and went, and nothing much has changed. So those are just two rather naive examples of how it's a surge. And of course, there's been a huge surge in IT and the technology of mobile phones and all this. But you know, I think the iPhone 26 may be not too different from the iPhone 16. It may have got to the level of complexity of as much as people want, and that may level off. But then some quite new technology may come in and take over. So I think one should hesitate to extrapolate the rate of progress which we see in something like AI, which is obviously at a especially exciting stage in its expansion. That's just to say you should be a bit cautious and think it may not be all that different in 20 years' time.
Frankly, I'm a little bit surprised to hear that, but I also do understand your rationale. I mean, you've mentioned somewhat famously on many occasions the idea that, okay, when we have something that can improve itself, right, the jumbo jet will have the jumbo jet itself will not take actions to create a better successor than itself. But every advanced AI model already is not only writing the code, but is discerning the research direction for its predecessor while you and I are speaking. Now, this is not hypothetical. So that does feel somewhat exceptional. But to your point, S-curves do seem to be what things do. And maybe we will run up against one of those, which makes me feel nice that, like, okay, maybe I'll have a little bit longer before everything is super confusing and being consumed by AI or something. Yes. Quick little points here as we wrap up, Martin. One is just thinking about some of the ideas you put on the table, lots to chew on here. One is, like, you know, you've talked about this very process-oriented view of the universe, which I think is an extremely important perspective. This idea of us not being necessarily the pinnacle of evolution, as if maybe there even is one necessarily, and the possibility of life elsewhere. And you've mentioned, yeah, we kind of know the future we'd want in 200 years. A big divergence I see is I think there will definitely be classes of persons who, even if we have reasonable provability that these systems are conscious, and are not just better at being astronauts, but are better at economic policy, are better at love, or whatever traits people want, right? But different people fetishize different sorts of things that they prioritize. I'm not bastardizing love here. I'm just saying, like, I different people pick different stuff. Like that, really, these things would be potentially just kind of better at like the full gamut, not just tasks and work, but experience and bliss and whatever. There's still people who would say there is no reason for us to bring something into existence like that, period. There are some people who, basically, the way I would frame it, Martin, the torch, an individual torch, is a species or an individual or a current form. And some people really just want that. And the torch has flame on it. Flame is life itself. Life is taking new forms, is transmuting and turning and bubbling and all. Some people really want the torch. And long term, like, marriage to the torch is scorn for the flame. It would be the prevention of the proliferation of that which would keep the process that you brought up rolling forward. There will be many at this key juncture, as you bring up our species is at a juncture. There's many in this juncture who would say, let us hold on to this torch until it is ash. Let us not aim for any kind of proliferation of the flame. What would you say to those people? Surely you can understand their position. It's very understandable as a human being. But you seem to identify more with life in this great process than the body that you were necessarily born into, the particular species you were born into. What would you say to the people who say, no, we only need to keep the torch. I do not want the flame to expand beyond us?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry they wouldn't have the vision, but I do agree, and I think you've made a very important point, that the main concern is that we don't stymie all future evolution beyond humanity by screwing things up in the next 50 years. And I think and this is, as you may know, one of the things I've been focused on in the last 10 years of trying to improve preparedness against catastrophic threats of new kinds,
threats, yes.
those which can affect the whole world. And we can all too easily think of things that could happen by error or by evil intent, which could be such a setback to our civilization and the social framework that it never recovers. There are things like that. So I think we've got to bear in mind that for the first time, we can conceive of global disasters because we're globally interconnected. And so that could be the end of humanity. And it goes back to somebody asked me a few days ago about the science fiction I'd enjoyed, and I was extolling Olaf Stapleton, a British writer in the 1930s, and who wrote a book called The Last and First Men. And this was about 18 different civilizations which spring up in different parts of the solar system over the next 3 billion years. And ours may just be one of them. He wrote another book called Star Maker, which is about someone who creates new universes. And that's visions about the multiverse. And he had another book relevant to AI. So novelists can perhaps nourish our imagination.
Yes, nourish the imagination. So this is interesting. You said Stapleton is the writer?
Olaf Stapleton, yes.
Olaf Stapleton, yes. Okay. So you began with saying, well, I'd be sorry they don't have the vision. And then you said maybe good science fiction could kind of get them there. I think what you also mentioned when you brought up existential risk, at least my interpretation would be, if it doesn't matter what it is, meteor, supervolcano, whatever, if something occurred that could really wipe this planet out, hypothetically. It would, in my opinion, it would make sense for life to be blazing and expanding in other places, not just here, to ensure that this project of which we are part, which for me is not the opposable thumb, it is non-dead matter, particularly sentient non-dead matter. That's the project I consider myself to be part of. It would make sense for that to blaze. But as you know, there will be many who will say, let us never create something that would supplant our position in terms of agency and power relative in the known universe. Your supposition would be mainly, if I'm nutshelling it correctly, A, it makes sense to have a greater vision of the bigger picture, and maybe fiction can help some people with that. B, there are risks of squashing the flame of life, at least in so much we know it. And we should make sure that it's blazing in ways that make it stronger and more resilient beyond kind of our current form. Is this a good summation of your position?
Yes, and of course, I think that with modern technology, global interconnectedness, the way we depend on grids of all kinds and worldwide networks, it makes the whole world vulnerable to breakdown. And this is something which is new in the last 20 years or so, and we've got to be mindful that we ought to make things more resilient in a number of ways. And we are building a centre in Cambridge which is addressing these, and a few other people, but not enough, are worrying about these issues. So I think this is crucial, and it's because we care about our species. We feel that we benefited hugely from the achievements of earlier generations who built our infrastructure, whether it's the sewers or the cathedrals and all these things that were made by earlier generations, and we benefit. So we don't want to hand on to our future generations a despoiled or degraded planet. So that's important. But of course, if life as advanced as us were unique to the Earth, and some people believe this, then of course snuffing ourselves out now would be a cosmic disaster, not a terrestrial one, because it would foreclose the likelihood of life spreading more widely. And so that's, I think, the one good argument for some kind of human spaceflight.
Yeah. So I guess just to close on this, you kind of brought up the center in Cambridge and thinking more about these issues. In our last conversation 9 years ago, you'd mentioned something along the lines of like it's just going to be so hard to govern this stuff internationally. Like you had said something about like, you made analogies like, imagine if there was some international tax law or international this kind of law. It's like, this stuff is just really tough, across borders, not just with France from America, but to China, to Russia. I mean, so you're clearly advocating for some degree of governance and coordination to bar some of the more tragic kinds of existential risk. But you've obviously expressed some pessimism that such kind of kumbaya getting along would even be possible. What are the kinds of coordination? We've talked about arriving eventually at this place of intelligence really blooming in a wonderful way. What are some of the things you hope and think are somewhat realistic on the governance side that might move us closer to there if we started now? Like, what's most important to you there?
Yes. Well, I think there are many reasons for pessimism. I mean, we have organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency, which manages to control and monitor what people are doing in the nuclear sphere, and the World Health Organization and all that, which helps to spread vaccines and all that. And they are, particularly now with recent American politics, very much under threat. So these are the reasons for being very concerned and depressed about what's happening. And another extra recent problem is that power is now wielded by multinational mega corporations, which have more power than individual nations, and because they can spread their tentacles across national boundaries, they're far harder to regulate. And so I think things are more dismal and harder to regulate than they were 10 years ago because of these developments. Also, the other point is that because these new technologies are so empowering, then it may only take just a few crazy people to trigger a world-spanning catastrophe. I mean, an engineered pandemic, which is far more virulent and transmissible than COVID-19 was. That could be released now. So that's one thing. And of course, breakdowns in the internet or electricity grid. And we're so dependent on electricity. If they last more than a few days, then that would lead to complete social breakdown. And so we are very, very vulnerable now. And so I think it's very important to raise these issues up higher on the agenda, and of course have more studies of scenarios to make sure that we make things less risky. I do think, actually, there's going to be a trade-off between three things we want to preserve: privacy, security, and freedom. And I think we're going to have to give up privacy because we can't afford a world in which even a few people are trying to engineer some pandemic.
So
it's not like a bomb. A few people can't make an H-bomb. It doesn't need big facilities, and the IAEA can monitor that sort of thing. But of course, now through bioengineering and maybe analogously through cyber attacks, only a few people are capable of creating a cascading global disaster. And I think the question is, can the world survive for very long without this happening? We've had new disasters. We had electricity failures in Spain and Portugal just last week before we're speaking. That was bad enough, but something like that on a global scale is not inconceivable.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of a closing note for you, we ultimately would want life to bloom and expand on Earth and beyond Earth in sort of grand, expansive, sentient ways. And we've got to make sure we don't drop the ball and squash the flame of life on this planet, because otherwise it's not spreading anywhere. For you, in terms of like you're expressing the general idea, hey, we should really make sure we kind of prevent people from creating such and such. I'm with you there. And giving up privacy maybe needs to be a trade, given how smaller the resource and personnel requirement is to create grave danger. We need to pinch down on that. That's a very tangible point I can write down. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you hope happens between U.S. and China efforts? We think there are some adversary relationships here that are unfortunate. China and the U.S. are racing to general intelligence with really no mind to these worthy successor traits we're speaking of. They're just doing it for military and economic power. Mm-hmm. Are there any hopes there for the kinds of conversations or the kinds of governance that emerges as we close out our interview here? Any closing thoughts or hopes on what happens there for governance?
Well, it's crucial that there should be such talks. I have to say, looking from this side of the Atlantic, the attitudes on the other side don't look very encouraging to me. But I think it is very important for the rest of the world that there should be at least toleration and cooperation where necessary between these major powers. And also, I think, to ensure that the global south doesn't get left behind. I mean, all these issues which come up in a more gradual sense in the context of climate change and all that. We're familiar with these issues, but I do think that these new issues stemming from cyber and bio are the ones that we need to focus on, because they could create sudden catastrophes. And I think, as I said, this could be a cosmic catastrophe if life is really special to the Earth. But, being human beings ourselves, we ought to care about the future of life, and also the lifetimes of our grandchildren, etc. And I think it would be very sad if we left difficult world for them, and we've got to try and plan ahead. In fact, if I can make a brief digression. I've had some discussions with Steven Pinker over various things.
Yes, of course. Yeah, he's in my neck of the woods.
And he's he thinks that the world is getting better and better. He's produced a book showing how quite rightly, the incidence of mortality has gone down, life expectancy has gone up, etc., etc. And he says things are getting better and better. But what he doesn't put in the picture are these entirely new kinds of threats of interlinked global processes that could cause catastrophe. That's downside. And he also thinks that there is ethical progress. Going back to the morality, which is the way you started this conversation, he would say that morality on average has improved since the Middle Ages. And that I would be doubtful about. And the reason I'd be doubtful is that in the Middle Ages, life was pretty miserable for most people.
Oh, yeah.
But they frankly couldn't do much about it. There wasn't very much they could do to improve their lives. And they at least thought ahead further than we do. They built cathedrals that took 100 years to be built because they thought that their grandchildren would still be around. So they did things which were constrained by the lack of technology. But the gap between the way the world could have been and the way it was not as great as that gap is now. Because now it's clear that we could provide a world as good as you and I enjoy for everyone. And we're far, far away. So I would say there's been negative progress in that the gap between the way the world is and the way it could be was smaller 500 years ago than it is today. And that's an indictment of our collective politics.
Yeah, man, well, it's a fun digression. I did like his Angels of Our Better Nature book. I do like that book, but I am also... Yeah, I think Emerson says society is a wave where like the individual pieces don't really... He's also, I think, very questioning of whether we're inherently becoming better in some grand moral way. So I also don't know if I would agree with that sentiment. My hope is, though, Martin, that some of the dialogues can be facilitated, and let's call them the most important sand traps, to use a golf analogy. The most important sand traps can be kind of fleshed out to be able to keep this flame going for us and whatever the heck is beyond us. So I'm rooting for all your initiatives out there in Cambridge and for whatever other dozen books you're working on right now, doubtless in the background. It's a real pleasure to be able to catch up with you after all these years. And thanks again for being here, Martin.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been great to chat.
So that's all for this 12th episode of the Worthy Successor series here on The Trajectory. A big thank you to you for tuning all the way through to the end of this episode, and a thank you to Martin Rees for being able to join us here. I spoke with Martin 10 years ago. The episode is still live on the AI and Business podcast, and we talked more about risk, and this time more about cosmic opportunity, and I couldn't have been more delighted with being able to shake out Martin's ideas. I want to share two things that kind of stuck out to me about this episode that I think are worth chewing on. In terms of this broader discourse of where should the future trajectory of intelligence go. So number one is it strikes me that many, many people who would be cosmologists, who would look out into the grand state space of space itself, and with no appreciable other life that we can at least detect in literally any meaningful way. We have hypotheses, but Fermi paradox just staying as real and staunch as it is for however many decades Martin's been involved, 7 decades of sort of gazing into the stars, never seeing anything come back. You could see someone reflect on that experience and say, wow, we as humans, like this thing, this is clearly the most valuable thing. You could see that easily validating an anthropocentric worldview in some way, shape, or form because of rarity or some other argument. But Martin very much sort of goes the other way, saying, there could be a wide state space of life outside of Earth, but there's clearly this process that built up to us that is going to keep processing. The universe is a process, life is a process, at least life on this planet. It might be a slightly different process in other places. I think that's an incredibly mature view. Obviously, I'm biased because I happen to agree with it. But it doesn't strike me that most cosmologists would have that opinion. The second thing, this is the most jarring perspective that I think has ever been shared about worthy successor criteria. What we always ask in this series is, what should be the traits or qualities of this entity that sort of runs the show of the future, or entities that run the show of the future long after humanity is gone? And Martin essentially provided two responses. One, which was very, very common, almost everybody else has said it, that he, at least at present, it seems to make sense to hope that it be conscious, because it seems right now that consciousness is important. I can't disagree with that. Bostrom would agree with that. Essentially everybody we've had on would agree with that. Richard Sutton would agree with that. We could go on and on. In addition, though, Martin had sort of the polar opposite view to what many of our previous guests have said. So Scott Aronson, if you remember Scott Aronson's episode, and I would recommend tuning into that one if you haven't, Scott is a brilliant mind. But Scott Aronson had said, I want it to have recognizably human values, like be doing things I get and understand, and be sort of moving in a direction that I get and I understand in some way, shape, or form. And that maybe, Scott even hypothesized, something like an intuition that we have, like the golden rule, may just be universal. All minds and all possible state space of mind may just hold on to that. Scott didn't express certainty about it, but he thought it was pretty reasonable that could be the case. And so he both hoped for and maybe on some level suspected really sturdy continuity with kind of hominidness. Martin said essentially his worthy successor criteria were only two. One, I hope it's conscious. Two, I hope it is doing things so wildly complex that I have no ability to even conceive of or imagine what it's doing, in the same way that, like the fish with legs that we eventually evolved from would have no idea what I'm doing in front of this camera, no idea what you're doing looking at your phone or your laptop screen, no idea what is happening when you're doing your accounting, no idea what a skyscraper is. It would just be brutal confusion. Is what he was hoping for. And I love everything about that answer. I certainly don't advocate, and neither does Martin, we unpack it in the episode, I certainly don't advocate for wild, rampant exploration of the state space of intelligence just for fun, screw all values, ha ha ha, who cares, let's just create the same kind of static you see on a TV. That's complexity, let's spread that into the universe. That's not the opinion here. The opinion is that richness and value and power and experience have blossomed up so far beyond us that there's just no way we could conceive of any of it, and that would be the rightful place for life to go. That's poetic and spiritual to me personally. And I think long ball, that is indeed where things should go. But to give credence to Scott Aronson and the others, I think in the near term, we definitely don't want to drop the ball on things like consciousness, things like autopoiesis, which we currently don't understand, and that hopefully we can do more unpacking of. One of our next episodes here on The Worthy Successor is with Ed Boyden, super eminent neuroscientist at MIT. He sort of brings to bear what it might look like to get to an understanding of consciousness. So you can stay tuned for that for future Worthy Successor episodes here on The Trajectory. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed Martin Rees. I had a lot of fun with this conversation. I hope you've enjoyed tuning in, and I'll catch you next time here on The Trajectory.